In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint skin tones and eyes on 3D printed statues. Hello, and welcome back to the time that you forgot to take out the garbage when your wife texted you and asked you to. She's now at the door, but instead, let's get on with the video. Today's video, I'm going to show you how I use the airbrush and brushes to get the effects that I got on Peter Parker's face for this Spider-Man bust from 3D Wicked, which you can find the links to their Patreon down below. Before I start any project, what I like to do is make sure I dust everything good and proper. I have a link to the video that I discussed dust on models, and you can find that on the screen right now. I started this project with a zenithal highlight. That's black undercoat with a white sprayed over the top from the direction of the light. I am using the Fairy Flesh set from the Nocturna series from Vallejo, and I'm going to start off with a base coat of reddish flesh, and this is where you can really see that zenithal highlight doing its job. The zenithal really helps to get volume into your tones, so that makes less work for you later on. The next step is going to be base flesh. You can see the comparison between base flesh and reddish flesh. I don't clean out my airbrush, as you can see, and I just add that base flesh straight into the airbrush on top of what was left of the reddish flesh, and add a bit of water to thin it down. Here you can see the comparison of the two colors. This color I'm going to spray directly from the light source, so this is going to come from the top at a slight angle. Don't forget the neck is not in shadow. The only part that would be in shadow is the underside of the chin. Don't forget that neck. The next color that I'm going to use is natural flesh. Again, I don't clean out my airbrush. I just throw in the paint, add some water, check that it's good, clear it out, and blast it onto the model. Again, I'm just coming straight from the light source, making sure to pay attention to parts where the light would hit. Don't ever forget that neck, and the forehead as well. The forehead is an important spot. This next color I'm using is medium flesh. I'm mixing this with quite a bit of the natural flesh that was left over. This is a slightly oranger tone, and it'll start to bring highlights into the piece. You'll notice I'm using this a lot more sparingly and only concentrating on the highest points of the skin where the light would hit most directly. So now I'm going to move on to Fairy Flesh. Fairy Flesh is a very light color. This is almost the highest point on the skin. This is basically where the light is at its strongest. I concentrate this around the forehead and the highest peaks of the cheeks, and on the tips of the ears and the chin. This fairy flesh tends to make the model look a little bit desaturated after a while, so in order to bring a bit more life back into that flesh, I'm going to use grimoire purple, and I'm going to make a glaze of this. You can find a video about glazes in the link on the screen right now. I'm using about 1 part paint to about 10 parts water, and as you can see, it's practically just water with a slight tint in it. We could probably almost call this a tint more than a glaze, to be fair. But let's not get too technical. So I'm going to spray this only from the bottom, mostly concentrating on where the shadows would be. This will help deepen the areas of shadow that I wanted to have look darker, and help create more volume overall, but bring life and saturation back into the skin. Here you can see I'm just adding a little bit more highlight back again, as we lose some of it by using the tint or the glaze. The other function of a tint and glaze as they are, it tends to smooth out gradations between colors as well. In order to get a little bit more volume to the shadows, I am now using contrast paint Guilliman Flesh, which adds a little bit more depth to the shadows for me. And then when I'm done with this step, I usually give it a solid clear coat of matte clear so that it can be protected for my hands to touch it while I'm continuing with the rest of the paint job. Still adding a bit more highlights here even at the end. The next step is super simple. All it is a base coat with Citadel contrast, Cygor brown, and all I'm doing is base coating the hair so that we have a frame for the face so that he doesn't look awkward in the video. This is a super simple step. I'm not going to do any work on the hair in this video. I thought I would include this step of me basing the hair anyway. So here I'm using Resin Flesh Shade, which is a shade from Citadel, and I'm adding it to the creases, and I'm using a sponge to wipe off any excess. It's not a huge step. I think you can miss this step. I just use this step because I like to have a little bit more depth in my shadows, and I feel like this kind of thing helps to get that little bit extra out of it. The main areas this makes a difference for me is in the ears, because I really don't want to do a lot of work on the ears. They're not a main focal point on the face. A little bit of shadow in the recesses, and that's all I need. Moving on to painting the eyes, I am going to use a Quadruple Zero Winsor & Newton Cotman round brush for everything in the next part of this video. Starting with the eyebrows, I'm going to use Oak Brown, and I'm going to use airbrush medium to help make my paints flow a little bit easier. I'm just brushing in the direction of the hair, every now and then adding a random direction because hairs don't behave the way you want them to, so I prefer to have a little bit of variation in the hair. I'm then going to add a little bit of black into that brown to make the eyebrows a little bit more predominant. Again, just following the same process, just chasing little lines across the face. I then use this burnt sand color to just add a couple of little highlights in the eyebrows, and that's going to be the end of them. For the lips, I use reddish flesh and I add a tiny little bit of red. Usually I use a dark red and not a lighter red. This will help give you a little bit more of a tint and make the lips look a little bit more full of blood. The lips don't have to be too complicated on a model like this. Mostly you're not going to have to shape them too much because the skin tone is pretty close. Starting with the eyes, I'm going to use black. Black is what's going to be the outline of my eyes. So now is the time to make sure that you're well rested and your hand is as steady as possible. You can see me using my pinky to balance my hand on the model. This is how I keep my hand steady. It's very important at this point to stay well within the lines of the eyes. The lines have been sculpted in there, usually are good guidance for you to go from. If you were to change the shape of the eye, this is where you would be changing the shape of the eye. At this point, follow exactly what you see and keep the black directly inside of the eyelids. I'm going to then use something like Mummy's Robes from Army Painter, and I'm going to base coat the whites of the eye. This paint is fairly thin and it's not very pigment rich, so I have to use a few layers of it. I kept this in on purpose because I want people to see that sometimes you have to use a couple of layers. It's not because your painting sucks, it's because you haven't put enough layers on yet. Make sure your paint is thin so you don't end up with weird texture in the paint. As long as your paint's thin, you can add a million layers and it will still look nice and smooth. With the whites done, I'm going to work on the corners of the eyes. I use a little bit of grey mixed with a tiny bit of blue, and I go straight into the corners of the eyes. This helps create a little bit of depth. It makes the eyeball look more round. I'll come back in again with the white again. This is probably the fourth coat of white now, and I concentrate that to the center, which would be the highlight of the eye, and this obviously helps create the depth in the eye that we want. We want to have it look as round as possible. At this point, I need to try and mask a little bit of that mascara look at the bottom of the eyelid. As he's a dude, he doesn't necessarily have makeup on, so if it was a female, that mascara line looks pretty good, but in general, guys don't have makeup on, so for Peter Parker, I add a little bit of pink, still keeping the darkness of that black underneath. So these are just glazes that I'm adding over here. I'm starting to add a little bit more red into that glazes. I'm just going to continue working that bottom eyelid to be a little bit redder rather than blacker. I then start adding a couple of highlight glazes just onto the bottom of the eyelid, so that helps create a little bit more depth in the eye and makes the eyes look a little bit more realistic. My style is very graphic anyway, so for me, I do tend to exaggerate certain areas quite a bit. This is something that works well with my style. I encourage you to try these things yourself. So here I'm just adding a slight amount of wash into the deepest crevices, just around the eyes, on the crow's feet, the little wrinkles above the eyelid and things like that. It's just one extra layer of depth really. I'm going to use that same wash on that piece between his nose and his lips, and just underneath his lip and on his chin. Helps to push that shadow just a little bit more and force the shadows and the lights where I want them to be. This is probably my 5th layer on these eyes now. That white can be a finicky one to get solid. So these are the colors I use for the eyes. I start off with the deepest blue and I mix it with a bit of black. The only tip I can really give you for this is make sure you're as balanced as possible. Put your fingers all over the model. Make sure that you've got your hands as stable as you can possibly have them. Rest your elbows on the table. And another trick that I can give you is to use an airbrush medium or a paint thinner to make your paints flow a lot better. I usually use a bit more of a loaded brush in this instance, because with paint being a liquid, it creates a rounded shape on the tip of the brush. So the more paint there is, the more chance you have of a rounded shape. Also, the more paint there is, the more chance you have of putting too much paint in the eyeball and having to start all over again. I then use the darkest blue with none of the black in it, and I start to progress all the way through to the lightest blue, making sure that the gradation is toward the bottom of the eye, as eyes tend to bounce light back in this fashion. So as you can see, we're on the 3rd layer of blues at the moment. I'm now adding the highest point of blue. This is at the lowest point of the iris. So that's 5 layers just for the iris. You can still take this much further, but my experience, this is the level I'm at, and I'm not going to take it any further than this. As for pupils, they're as simple as the iris. Just keep it in the center of the iris and use a loaded brush and try your best to make it as circular as possible. The irises tend to be on the upper portion of the eye. They're never in the bottom portion of the eye or directly in the center, as that seems to look weird. I'm adding a tiny bit of highlights into the tear ducts here. And then this is the highlight of the eye. I use a pure white so that I can add the highlight just to force the direction of the lights with my painting. And then this is the part that ruins all models for photography, but looks really good in real life. I use a clear gloss over the eyes. This helps make them look wet and alive. This is the best part of all the models for me. Unfortunately, it's also the part that makes the models look terrible in photos, because the light reflects horribly off that gloss. I also gloss the lips, as that is a wet place. You don't have to go overboard with this, just really get it on the lips just so that you got a bit of change in texture from the matte skin to the gloss lips and the shiny gloss eyes. It helps to look a little bit more realistic. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope that you learned something from what you saw. I hope that it wasn't too confusing, and if you have any questions, please be sure to leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to get back to you. Between the intro and the outro, something has changed. If you notice that something has changed, leave a comment with what you think has changed down below. And one last thing, don't forget to like and subscribe. Small channels like mine need that interaction to help us grow. It is up to you to make channels like mine be seen by more people. Thank you so much for hanging around, and if you didn't like that video, Everybody already knows what you need to do. Just f off! It gets harder and harder every time. Harder and harder, I tell you.